Hi, good afternoon. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of FAN. We're a nonprofit that presents programming exploring human development across the lifespan. I'm honored to welcome you to today's conversation between Robert Sapolsky and Oliver Burkeman. Thank you for joining us. FAN's YouTube channel has an archive of over 350 videos of past events, so be sure to subscribe to the channel to get updates when new recordings are posted. And now for some introductions. It is such a delight to welcome back Robert Sapolsky, the John A. and Catherine Fry Gunn Professor of Biology, Neurology, and Neurosurgery at Stanford University, as well as a research associate at the Institute of Primate Research at the National Museums of Kenya. Professor Sapolsky has studied the effects of stress and stress hormones on the brain in the laboratory, while also conducting studies concerning the relationships among social rank, social affiliation, and stress-related disease in a population of wild baboons. Professor Sapolsky's books for non-scientists like me include Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, the acclaimed Guide to Stress, Stress-Related Diseases and Coping, Behave, the Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst, and most recently, Determined, A Science of Life Without Free Will. Professor Sapolsky interviewed his Stanford colleague Jamil Zaki for FAN this past fall, and we really like him and are so glad that he's back. Joining him, another big favorite of ours, Oliver Burkeman, who worked for many years at The Guardian, where he wrote a popular weekly column on psychology called This Column Will Change Your Life. His books include the New York Times bestseller 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, and The Antidote, Happiness for People Who Can't Stand Positive Thinking. And of course, his latest bestseller, Meditations for Mortals, 4 Weeks to Embrace Your Limitations and Make Time for What Counts. We were thrilled to host Oliver in the fall for Meditations for Mortals and grateful that he accepted our invitation to interview Robert today. We're in for a big treat. Let's welcome Robert Sapolsky and Oliver Burkeman back to FAN.
Thank you so much, Lonnie. It's really great to be here
Well,
and to be a guest again
likewise.
of hello. Right. Sorry, I'm just getting some sound. Okay, there we go. I'm going to turn my volume up so I can actually hear you. Um, it's great to be back, and I'm really happy to be doing something again for FAN who do such important work. I would jump at the opportunity to have a conversation with Professor Sapolsky about any topic at all, but this one is especially exciting to me because it has struck me for a long time that this question of free will and whether we have it and what it means if we do or we don't is possibly the most kind of mind-blowing question in the whole of philosophy by some definitions. It's something that threatens to kind of completely transform all the ways we think about all sorts of issues, who we hold responsible for things, whether we can blame people for the bad things that they do, give them credit for the good things that they do. And it just has so many ramifications. I wanted to just begin before we get into the conversation by giving an example of this that I used when I wrote about this in The Guardian because it really made it vivid for me thinking through this, talking to various philosophers about it. For those who have no familiarity with the problem that we're addressing ourselves here to tonight. The example is, suppose you're feeling sort of moderately hungry one afternoon and you walk into your kitchen and you see that there's a banana and an apple in your fruit bowl, and you decide to choose the banana and not the apple to address your hunger. This is one of those completely mundane choices that we make all through every day, and it seems completely obvious to me and pretty much to everybody, I think, that you could have made a different choice in that moment. If you rewound the tape of history, so to speak, to the very moment before you chose the banana, so that everything else in the world was exactly the same, there doesn't seem to be any reason why you couldn't choose the apple instead. But if I understand him correctly, Professor Sapolsky in this book is arguing that this can't possibly be true. It can't possibly be the case that whoever is where you talk about in this example, was free to make any choice other than the one that I made because, well, what caused my choice of a banana? Maybe it was a combination, maybe it was my preferences that come from my upbringing, maybe it was something in my genes, maybe it was something to do with the chemicals my body was telling me that it needed. It doesn't matter what level you look at this, what level you try to explain it on, all those things had prior causes. Um, if you trace them back, you get to the point of the fact that everything in my genes and everything in my upbringing depended on my parents meeting. If you look at what caused my parents to meet, you suddenly have thousands of causes, including the rise of Hitler and the functioning of the British railway system. And all these causes go back and back and back and back and back. And eventually you get to the Big Bang. And the implication is that possibly everything that we do was in some sense possible to predict from the very beginning of time. Obviously, this is an incredibly dizzying thought, and it has some extraordinary moral implications, especially that I hope we'll get into. But just to sort of dive into this, Robert, is that a fair account of one of the ways of looking at the problem that we're talking about here?
Um, it is, and thank you for the introduction. The only modification in there is I don't think 2 seconds after the Big Bang, everything was predetermined in this, I don't know, Calvinist sense, or even a non-theological version of it. It was not predetermined. At this moment, there are multiple possible futures, and they are not predictable because of all sorts of, hair-raising stuff like chaoticism and non-linearity of systems and such that we can get into. But mainly, once something has occurred, you will see, you will be able to see the pathway by which it went from the Big Bang to that moment. Um, Once the unpredictable elements of the universe have done their thing, so that like a breeze comes in the room 1 second before and it carries the smell of who knows what that makes bananas irresistible. Once that is factored in and the behavior has occurred, you will then see it is the mechanistic, deterministic outcome of everything that came before. I mean, sort of the starting principle being things don't happen from out of nowhere. Even in some of the most interesting domains of like particle physics, blah, blah, but where it's got nothing to do with bananas versus apples.
I'm grateful for that clarification. It doesn't do anything to improve our level of freedom in the situation, does it? It seems wildly at odds with our day-to-day experience to think that we lack this kind of freedom. I'm really interested if you could give a sort of overview of, I suppose, what you take yourself to be doing in this book, because I'm tempted to suggest that actually persuading people that they do not have free will, that their choices are not freely made, is feels like an impossible project, something that violates our intuitions so completely that even you would, would
Well,
would struggle to do that.
as I do, and thus it almost completely overwhelms our intuitions. Um, I would say kind of where the book came from my previous book of about 6 years ago, Behave, the Biology of Our Best and Worst Moments, where I thought what I had adequately done in the book was make it clear to anyone that free will wasn't possible. Because essentially what the book did was say, here's a behavior. And we ask, why did it happen? And the answer is because of what was going on in your nervous system milliseconds ago. Um, but you also have to ask what in the environment in the previous seconds triggered the nervous system to do that. And then you have to ask what about this morning's hormone levels made your brain more or less sensitive to those environmental triggers. And then before you know it, you're often running with the previous month's worth of trauma or euphoria and adolescence and childhood and fetal life and genes and culture, remarkably, is highly relevant. What kind of culture were your ancestors inventing? In what kind of ecosystems? Because that was shaping what your mother was doing within seconds of your birth. And of course, at the bottom of the barrel is evolution and why we turned out to be this sort of species rather than that sort. And it just seemed intuitively obvious that when you put all those pieces together, there's no room for free will at all. And after going through this god-awful 700 plus page book, it was clear to me that like I hadn't really convinced a whole lot of people. Or like I'd give a public talk about it, and after an hour of going on about all this, someone would say, "Well, it seems to me if this is true, there's less free will than we may commonly think." I said, "Oh my God, I've got to come back and write another book now where I say, yeah, do you notice what this implies? There's no free will whatsoever." Which was forcing me to come back with this very ham-hocked return to this material, like saying it's not possible and it's not there. And intuitions are very poor guideposts for figuring out how the universe works. And I guess the main novel thing that I did in the book, rather than cranking out another book saying the exact same damn thing, was in the face of the almost universal response to that being despair and resistance, of arguing, in fact, it would be fantastic if everybody got rid of belief in free will, and every inch we could nudge in that direction makes the world a better, more humane place. This is actually good news.
I really want to focus as our conversation unfolds on that kind of optimistic and humane vision that sort of permeates this book. Let's stay for a little moment on the method that you adopt in the book to try to disabuse us of this deep intuition that we're actually freely making the choices that we make, and that therefore, if I work hard and get a promotion, I'm entitled to claim a moral right to more money than somebody who can't be bothered to work hard and doesn't get the promotion. There are millions of examples like this that we'll come to a few of. It seems to me there are a couple of ways to approach this problem. If you want to deny free will, you can either do the thing where you kind of, at a very abstract level, sort of a priori level, I guess philosophers would call it, you say, look, everything that is true about the world now at t equals 1 has a cause in the previous state of the world at t minus 1, and then everything that was true of the world then has a cause in the previous. And then you just sort of stop, and then your book is very short, like Sam Harris's book about free will is very short because that's what he's doing. And then there's what you did here in Determined, which is to, in this kind of extraordinary cinematic and kind of almost surprisingly gripping, I want to say, way, go work backwards, right? From an act in the world through every link in the chain, not only at the level of molecules and atoms and muscles and nerve impulses and physical matter, but also at the level of culture and society, and just sort of establish in this incredibly forensic way that there isn't some moment in this chain where sort of, free will sneaks itself in. There just isn't any small bit of it. That's quite a sort of audacious approach to choose, I suppose, rather than the kind of the quick version, as it were.
Well, I'm sort of a neurobiologist, and I'm sort of an endocrinologist, and I'm sort of a primate evolution person, and I'm sort of a bunch of things. And that has, I think, pulled me to wanting to like get down into the trenches, into the grass, whatever, in terms of marching through this, because the reality is if all you do is study the brain, cool stuff comes out of that, but you cannot disprove free will with neurobiology. There's no neurotransmitter that proves there's no free will. And similarly, there's no hormone. Endocrinology doesn't do it, and genetics doesn't do it, because genes are mostly about potentials and vulnerabilities rather than inevitabilities, and none of these. But you put all the pieces together, and I think two important things come out of it. The first thing is you see they're not separate pieces. They all merge into one like big arc of causality. Um, because, for example, if you're talking about the effect of genes on behavior, implicitly, you're talking about the millions of years of the genes evolving. And implicitly, you're talking about your fetal life when you had epigenetic imprinting of those genes. And implicitly, you're talking about which genes you turned on or off during breakfast today and everything in between. So it forms one continuous arc. It's not all these different disciplines bolstering each other's sort of necessary limitations. Instead, it turns into one continuous matrix of how you get here. And the second point being, when you then look at the nature of this arc of causality, there is not a crack anywhere in there into which you could shoehorn a notion of free will. And all of the attempts, including like very well thought out ones, I'm trying not to be snarky here and a jerk, but you look at them closely, and ultimately, every one of them requires a step that's magic. And there's no magic in this.
I think if you're going to manage to not be snarky about your opponents in this debate, you're going to be the only, major thinker in it who is resisting that. There is an enormous amount of snark. It's one of those fields where people who believe the opposite from someone else don't only disagree, but can't begin to understand how the people on the other side could possibly hold the views that they hold. You write, I think the quote's from the book, or maybe it's elsewhere that I've heard you say it, that a huge amount of humanity's misery is due to myths about free will. I think this would be a good way into the surprisingly optimistic direction that you take all this in, because obviously the natural thing for a lot of people to want to think is, well, if it were true that none of our acts are freely chosen, then it's just a disaster. It seems to sort of drain all the meaning from life. It seems to sort of eradicate my very sense of selfhood to know that I'm just carrying out causes. And this is a deeply depressing scenario. There are some philosophers I know who do agree with you, but who also argue for a position they call illusionism, which is that we should continue to pretend to the masses that that we do have free will because it will be such a disaster if everybody believed the truth. What do you mean when you say that a huge amount of humanity's misery is due to myths about free will?
Well, when you really look at the world with the right level of jaundiced sort of objectivity, what becomes clear is essentially we live in a world where some people are treated way better than average because of things they had nothing to do with. And lots of people are treated way worse than average because of things they had no control over. And not only is that the case, but then we invent all these myths like it's a just world and people are entitled to certain things, people earn certain outcomes. And for the people sitting on top of the hierarchy, that is indeed a very comforting thing. And the notion that you did not earn your CEO-ship can be grounds for being bummed out. But if you really are demoralized by the notion that we are just biological machines and have earned nothing, blah, blah, if that really bums you out, it means you're one of the lucky ones. You're one of the privileged ones. You're one of the ones who got born into a spot in the world where there were vaccines and running water and maybe parents who loved you and all of that, et cetera, et cetera. But for most people in the world, at various points, you are treated badly and it has to do with stuff you had no control over. And then society, or at least a lot of Western mindsets, then slathers that over with this myth of, and yeah, people get what they deserve. People have agency. There's a me in there that somehow is separate of all that biology yuck. And that me can be held to be responsible for some of what it does.
You give the example of the idea of grit at one point, I think, as I recall, this notion that sure, we're born into different circumstances, But if you happen to be relatively unlucky in the circumstances into which you are born, you can cultivate persistence, you can cultivate grit. And if you fail to do that, then maybe you can't be blamed for your circumstances of your birth, but you can be blamed for failing to develop grit. I take it you don't agree with that characterization of things.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the most magnetically way in which people get into trouble and get pulled into believing they see free will because there's a false dichotomy going on here. Most people will accept that there's all sorts of attributes that we are gifted or cursed with that we had no control over. And yeah, if you're not 7'2", you were probably not going to play professional basketball. And you had nothing to do with that. Yes, there's all sorts of attributes. Some of us have lovely symmetrical faces. Some of us are good at remembering long strings of digits. Some of us whatever. Yeah, there's a biology, there's inevitability, there's a lack of free will about the attributes we have. But oh, what we do with them, what we do with them, do we show tenacity? Are we self-indulgent and squander away our gifts? That domain is where it's just irresistible to decide that you're seeing free will because it's often so damn inspiring. Like there's this one person who, this individual, this woman, Wilma Rudolph, in 1960s Olympics, Wilma Rudolph was the fastest woman on earth, and she got gold medals left and right. And when she was a kid, she had polio. She had leg braces. She was one of 14 kids born to sharecropper parents in Tennessee or something. And somehow she had the grit that she decided she was going to learn how to walk without her leg braces, and then how to walk without a notable limp, and how to begin to trot, and all, and it hurt like hell every step in the way. And whoa, oh my God, by sheer force of will, she became the fastest human on earth. That's totally amazing. That's totally inspiring. And that's totally false because there's not like the attributes that you have are not made out of biological stuff. And what you do with it are made out of, Puritan backbone and tenacity and self-discipline. And somehow that's magical stuff. Willpower is made of the exact same biology as whether or not you're left-handed or right-handed. It is just as biological. It's a very different sort of biology. But what we do with our attributes at all those junctures, whether when the going gets tough, the tough get going, that's made of biology also. And the people who at every juncture in the road seem to never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, that's made of mechanism also. We are no more sort of the agents of our capacity to exert willpower than we are of whether we're left-handed or right-handed or have, you know, color blindness or some other thing that, ooh, it's easy to see we had no control over.
Yeah, so another way of, or maybe a way of summarizing that or something is to say that, even if you are successful at sort of changing your personality in some way or triumphing over your circumstances in some way, you had to already have the kind of personality that was capable of changing your personality or capable of triumphing over adversity. It's immediately obvious how that should engender a more compassionate attitude towards people we might otherwise condemn as, you know, not having enough get up and go, not pulling their weight. But people watching, listening tonight, and even if they're not already familiar with this debate, will be beginning to see, I'm sure, that it also has something kind of alarming to say about people who do sort of outright things we want to say are outright bad or evil, right? It's not just a question of the tenacity thing is really important, but then it seems to give on to this question of like, well, where do serial killers fit into this picture? Are we saying, as I think you must be saying, that they can't ultimately be held responsible for their actions in the sense that they decided to do something that they could just as easily have decided not to do? I can't remember whether you mentioned the famous case of Charles Whitman in your book or not. I'm sorry if I'm uh, uh, overlooking exactly when you do. But as you know, there's a very famous case in the free will literature about a man who committed one of it was in the 60s, but still I think is one of America's worst mass shootings. And he had actually said in diary entries or in letters, I think, prior to being shot dead in the course of committing his crimes, that that he wanted his brain to be examined by autopsy because he hadn't felt like himself recently, and he was finding himself prompted to strange thoughts and strange actions. And the story goes, I'm not sure how historically accurate it is, but that actually doesn't matter for this conversation. But the story goes that in the autopsy that followed his killing by police, he was found to have a large brain tumor that is plausibly what was causing him to act uh, out of character and so with such devastatingly bad consequences. And the argument runs essentially, if you hear about the discovery of the brain tumor in Charles Whitman and your attitude is changed towards him, if some part of you thinks, well, then okay, it wasn't quite as much his fault, and I'm not quite as willing to just condemn him as evil, then you've really got to say that about everybody, whether they happen to have a brain tumor or not, because everybody has some configuration of their brain that causes them to do everything they do by definition, based on how we understand uh, human action and behavior and brains. This does then seem to lead to a situation where punishing people, putting them in jail to punish them, as opposed to the other reasons for putting people in jail, is completely unjustifiable. Did you go that far?
Yeah. When you really look at it, blaming and punishing anyone as virtues in and of themselves, as opposed to sort of instrumental means of changing their behavior, but blame and punishment, in essence, not only makes no sense intellectually, it makes no sense morally either. And just as strongly, praise and reward doesn't either. Um, we are biological machines. And within that framework, sometimes it's a lot easier to see the machineness. He had a brain tumor. That explains it. In the United States, the majority of men on death row awaiting execution, a majority of them have a history of concussive head trauma to their prefrontal cortex. And we can get into what that part of the brain does, but that's basically the part where whether it works well or not determines whether you are going to do the harder thing when it's tempting to do something otherwise. The majority of these people have a history of those are the edge cases for us. We're pretty good at accommodating those. Oh, of course, because they had brain damage. There was a singular event that damaged their brain. And similarly, we could say, oh, of course, they inherited a couple of $1 billion from their real estate father. Yeah, they started off already on third base, kind of thing. Those are the ones that are easy for us to see. What's challenging is, you get a jury and hear this person's frontal cortex was destroyed in a car accident when they were 9 years old, and they've now killed a whole bunch of people. It's easy to see that's the event from which you can see sort of this arc of steel as to how they wound up who they are. What's the huge challenge for us is that in most cases, instead, there's a gazillion different little spider webs of causality from all those different little events. And it's really hard for us to do sort of, distributed causality to see, for one thing, that there's all these little spider webs, and to incorporate in that we didn't know about most of them 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 100 years ago, and that the vast majority we still don't understand. But more importantly, this inconceivable thing that when you put all those spider webs together, it is just as made out of steel as that one starting point, and this person had their frontal cortex destroyed in an accident. That one's just easier to see. It's really hard to imagine that a bazillion different tiny spider webs of influence collectively is just as determinative. It's just a harder problem. It takes more work to see that.
There's a whole other dimension where this leads my mind. I know that this isn't, we're not here to have a no sort of overtly political discussion, but even from over here in Yorkshire, it's pretty clear that it's difficult at the moment for anybody in the United States not to feel enmeshed in an extraordinarily volatile political situation, which sits on top, of course, of a sense that the country, and believe me, it's happening here too, is sort of completely sorted into tribes that think the other is just motivated by badness and wanting to be bad. And you certainly do see some attempts to sort of foster understanding at that level of the electorate, but it's a consequence of what you're arguing here that a political leader, a president who I might wish to condemn and blame in absolutely no uncertain terms, I have to accept that if I had been, I may be quoting Sam Harris here, my apologies if so, but if I had been born with his genes and had his experiences from birth, I would be him. There isn't anything that in the corner of my brain that would hold back from doing all the things that he has done or is doing. So I just wonder how that thought should change our sort of moral positions on politics. I don't think it means that we have to drop our it doesn't necessarily have to weaken our values about the kind of society we want to see and the kind we don't want to see, but it complicates very significantly this sort of straightforward, albeit very psychologically tormenting situation of just blaming people for what they're doing.
Um, exactly. And and nobody was an agent of how they wound up, blah, 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 that whole song and dance. Amid that, we have to protect society from individuals who wound up being the sort of biologically troubled, damaged machines that go about murder, for example. We also need to protect society from individuals of great power who turned out to be people who are remorseless and incapable of empathy and run on bullying and hatred and all of that. And at the same exact time, we need to make sure society is able to motivate people to do the hard work to become like really good at ballet or really good at removing brain tumors or things without making them feel like they intrinsically have more moral worth than everybody else. And these are huge challenges, but yeah, you got to make sure there's not murderers running around on the streets, and you got to make sure the person who's going to take out your glioblastoma tomorrow morning actually knows what they're doing. You really do need to, and in the latter case, it takes a whole lot of motivation because that person had to work really hard, but somehow you have to subtract out of that the notion of this person's damaging characteristics being deserving of retribution, having a moral worth of its own. And likewise, somebody being really good at playing the piano or really good at taking out brain tumors, having a moral worth that somehow is derived from that because they had nothing to do with it. They turned out to be that sort of way. All of us just turned out to be because of what came before and what came before and all of that. All of us just turned out to be the sort of persons that we are. and there's no intrinsic moral value in any of the ways we turned out because we had nothing to do with it.
It's a sort of giant case for the proverb, the saying there, but for the grace of God go I, but also in its positive form, which is I don't need to feel so bad about myself in the ways that I may fall short, not just that I need to uh, be conscious of my privilege, but it's certainly possible to see in that the potential for a real kind of vision of solidarity and community and forgiveness combined with enjoyment of each other's skills without jealousy or envy. As I say, it doesn't seem clear to me how we're going to get there, but it does seem to be mandated on some level by what you're arguing.
Yeah. If you really take all of this to the logical conclusion, it makes no sense whatsoever to ever hate someone. That makes as little sense as hating an earthquake or hating a virus that turns out to be really good at getting into your lung cells. It makes no sense whatsoever. But this brings us to a critical point in terms of my now spending all my time going on about stuff like this. Amid that, 99% of the time, I can't function as if there's no free will. I get pissed off at things, or somebody says, "Ooh, nice sweater." And for at least 3 seconds afterward, I feel like I am a better human than average. And since January 20th, the pull towards hatred in me has been enormously powerful and challenging. Yeah, this isn't easy. So one version of that is to say, yeah, this is going to be really hard. This is going to happen overnight. And if it did, it would probably make a mess of everything. And this revolutionary idea is going to take centuries and centuries to slowly be revolutionary. But amid that being overwhelming and discouraging, what I take great comfort from is over and over, we've done it. We've done it in the past over and over, and we do it every single day. We don't believe that illness is caused by witches anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And parenthetically, we don't believe that the logical response to witches doing that is to burn them at the stake. We don't believe that epilepsy is a sign that somebody is demonically possessed. We don't believe that a kid who has trouble in school learning to read and makes very characteristic reading errors is lazy and unmotivated. They've got this neurobiological thing we call dyslexia. And it's so commonplace that, like, you're an airline pilot and biologically you turned out to be the sort of individual who in the springtime gets hay fever. You had nothing to do with it. You had hay fever. And in order to have that controlled, you take some antihistamines, which, among other things, makes you drowsy. And you're not a competent pilot in the days that you're taking antihistamines, not because you're a rotten human or whatever, but nonetheless, we have a society that has subtracted free will out of that domain and nonetheless can run safely and humanely. Say something like, oh, if you're a pilot and you're taking antihistamines, you can't fly for X number of days afterward. Oh my God, that's obviously it's not their fault. They get hay fever. Yet in the past, illness of any sort was a sign of a blemished soul, was a sign of God acting to punish you. Oh, we so effectively have subtracted gibberish about free will out of that one that we don't even recognize that when we say, oh, yeah, it's not the pilot's fault, but yeah, they shouldn't fly if they're taking antihistamines, we have just endorsed a view of the world of us as biological machines. And all we've been doing for centuries is getting good at seeing that to be the case in more and more realms. And every step of the way that we've done this, not only hasn't the roof caved in, society's become a much better place. It's a really good thing that we don't burn people at the stake anymore if the weather is bad, or if they have an epileptic seizure, or if they turn out to sneeze a lot and have to take this like hay fever medication, and that their visual spatial coordination is not so hot afterward because they're drowsy. We we do it over and over. You're in an elevator and the person behind you suddenly like steps on the inside of your foot and it's painful as hell, and you're about to turn around and snarl at them, and you see that they're blind. Oh, we have become the sort of society where we have learned, oh, that's how things turned out for it's not their fault. Sure as hell would have been points in the past where blindness was viewed as God's punishment,
Right.
where congenital disease is still interpreted in some Yahoo outposts in this country as an act of God punishing the parents for their sins. But for the most part, whoa, we've done it. You don't get pissed off at the blind person, you say it's not their fault. All we're doing is seeing more and more domains where we got to get good at doing this.
I wanted a moment to try just lest things get too amicable. I want to try to sort of characterize as well as I can the strongest kind of my understanding of the strongest argument against your position. Before we do that, just quickly, I do want to address an objection that I know will be bubbling in the minds of some people today. In fact, I know that it had already bubbled up in the mind of one person who submitted a question prior to the beginning of this conversation, which is the sort of meta paradox objection that says, like, well, if we've got no free will, what are you doing going around trying to persuade people of anything? Like, why are you doing this? What's the I guess the other argument to that is you've got no choice, but what isn't there something strange about going around trying to persuade people of a position that they have no choice but to agree with or disagree with because they don't have any choice in anything they do?
It's not strange as long as you deal with what, in lots of ways, is the worst direction for somebody to get steered into by deciding there's no free will, which is to decide thus nothing can change. Um, and writ large at the governmental level, perhaps, that thus there's no responsibility to try to change anything. Things it is totally compatible that change occurs because change occurs dramatically on the individual level, on the societal level. There's a whole job for people that shows that changes can happen, which is the people who take tattoos off you because it turns out you regret the childish one you got when you were drunk when you were 17, or that relationship turned out not to work out, and that like heart, whoever's name on it is like really not quite accurate, or because at some point you decided that having a swastika tattooed on your arm was, and now you're an ex-white supremacist. Change happens, and that seems intuitively to totally run counter to the notion that we have no agency. The critical thing in that is to recognize we do not choose to change.
Right.
We are changed by circumstance, and we are changed by that circumstance as a function of who we turned out to be going into that event. And
So you may, sorry.
once you recognize that, part of the machineness is us recognizing that we're biological machines and we can get some insight as to where the buttons and the levers and the switches are. And some of us are thus able to act upon that, turn out to be the sort of individual who can get some control over pushing this button in this circumstance instead of, pushing that one. Change is dramatic, but we do not choose to change. We are changed by circumstance. And I turned out to be the sort of individual who is motivated for a whole messy set of motivations, good and bad, to want to have people be changed into believing there's no free will.
And likewise, if you're watching this today and you find yourself purchasing a copy of Professor Sapolsky's book, which you should, because it is hugely worth your time, uh, and you read it and you find yourself persuaded by his argument, you will have changed. It's just that you won't have had any choice in any of that, in any of that, in any of that process. Let me, as previously advertised, let me try to put an opposing case. If people are not familiar with this debate, I think sometimes the case as we've described it here against free will can seem so the case as you put it, as you present it anyway, can seem so watertight that you just assume that the philosophers who have thought deeply about this would all be on side. But firstly, at least according to the most recent polls of philosophers that I've seen, they're most of them reject it. They think we do have free will. Even more strangely to the layperson, um, even more strange is the reason why the majority of them dispute it. Not because they would disagree with you that everything is determined, but because they think it's perfectly possible for everything to be determined and for us still to have free will. They think these two positions are compatible, which is why they're known in the jargon as compatibilists. And you're about as rude as you get in the in the book about them, not by name, because I don't think that's in your temperament. But there's I think this is from the book here. You sort of establish their argument in three steps. Wow, there have been all. I hope you don't mind me reading this out. Wow, step A. There have been all these cool advances in neuroscience, all reinforcing the conclusion that ours is a deterministic world. Step B. Some of those neuroscience findings challenge our notions of agency, responsibility, and deservedness so deeply that one must conclude that there is no free will. Step C. Nah, it still exists. Um, so first of all, I mean, I briefly say if you want to add anything to that, and then I will attempt, without necessarily believing it myself, to put a respectable case for compatibilism.
When you read through compatibilist philosophers, and you not only bring some cynicism to it, but much more importantly, when you bring some knowledge about how this machine works, what they all say at the end is, nah, but no, there's still free will. And here's why they say pulling a rabbit out of the hat. There's always a spot where magic comes in. And magic that may be philosophically sound, but is not biologically sound or mechanistically sound or not the way like the physical features of the universe work.
So here's one way of pushing back against this. What if free will is uh, not a magical property, not a sort of magical thing that stands outside of science in a spooky fashion, but what if it's more like a skill? What if it refers to the ability to take in various facts in one's environment, weigh them in a sort of rational and logical way, form an intention to act, and then act on that intention in a sort of orderly and sequential sense. If that were the case, it seems quite easy to see that that's the kind of skill that a newborn baby doesn't have. And if a newborn baby flailing its limbs around knocks a vase off the countertop, at least after a split second, perhaps we come to our senses and realize we can't blame the baby for that at all. Perhaps a murderer who had a severe brain tumor also escapes some or all of that because they don't have that skill. There is something that defective in them that prevents them from looking at what they could do, looking at what pain they would cause if they took option A over option B and choosing the right way. But then look at Bernie Madoff. Look at somebody who, to all intents and purposes, as far as we know, as far as I know from the reporting, absolutely knew what he was doing, was not forced into it by sort of unusually acute circumstances, at least at the beginning, was completely capable, in some sense of the word capable, of doing the right thing, and decided to do the wrong thing and to inflict suffering on other people because it benefited him in certain ways that he wanted to be benefited. Maybe I'm just coming back to the point of people say, but it really feels like free will. there's something different about him as compared to Charles Whitman, the guy with the brain tumor, or a newborn baby breaking a vase, isn't there?
Yeah, because Charles Whitman, it's easy to see the causality. It was a brain tumor. In a baby, it's easy to see the causality. Their neurons haven't wired up sufficiently yet, and they don't have a lot of myelin, white matter in their brain, and come back 25 years later, and they'll be pretty good at not knocking. But with Bernie Madoff, or with the person you know who is very kind, or the person you know who is easily jealous or self, or any of these, it's just more work to see all the threads, all the bits of causality, because as soon as like you look at, so why did this person do this? Yeah, it had something to do with their hormone levels this morning, but it also had something to do with the fact that their ancestors grew up in deserts instead of rainforests. And you come up with different types of religions and moral structures in those places. And ever since then, children have been raised in that culture to wind up being the sort of person who would replicate that value with their own children. Like everything from like, wait, there was a high infectious disease load in this part of Europe 400 years ago. And that's a significant predictor of levels of xenophobia in that population now. That's one of the findings in the field. It's not hugely predictive, but like you grow up in a world where there's lots of infectious diseases, and you construct a culture in which strangers are scary and not welcome. And that winds up predicting something about attitudes towards immigrants in different parts of Europe, but also whether or not you got your stomach having a little painful twinge 1 second ago has something to do with the decisions you make also, and everything in between. It's just so much harder to see it in a Bernie Madoff or someone we think of as kind and generous and empathic, and someone who we think of as an impulsive jerk. And it just takes more work to see the threads because it's complicated. It's unbelievably complicated.
I think we're going to be, before too long, wrapping up this hour. So I want to make sure I get the questions in that I'd wanted to get in. Otherwise, I would continue to try to steel man the compatibilist position a bit further. But we can maybe do that in after hours. How do people? I mean, this book has been already, I think, enormously successful and well received. But my sense is that, and we were talking a little bit about this before we started. Not everybody responds positively to the thought that there is no free will. And you mentioned that you sometimes get strange communications from people who seem deeply troubled by it.
Yeah. Which has been unsettling because amid my writing a combative book, I'm very, very non-confrontational about anything. Oh, I'm one of these stupid professors who sits and thinks or sits and looks through a microscope, kind of thing. But the most common furious email that I've gotten has been along the lines of, "Oh, you're just going to have murderers running around in the streets, you permissive, you know, disastrous left-leaning." Yeah, that's been one version. Or the other has been just sort of a theological damning me to hell or whatever. But the really moving, challenging ones have been, I'm thinking of one in particular. A guy sent me an email that consisted of 2 words, and they were not polite. Um, and just on a whim, I emailed back with 1 word. I said, "Why?" And he kind of emailed back 4 very angry words. And like we went back and forth. And eventually, what he got around to saying was, he had been born under incredibly lousy, unlucky circumstances. He had everything going against him. All he was surrounded by people who had more luck than him. And at some point, he got it together and he worked so hard to resist temptations. And he takes so much pride in the fact that he's stably married. He's a loving father. He's got a good job. He goes to work. And his entire sense of who he is built on, I pulled myself out of this. How dare you say that is an undeserved sense on my part? And that I find like very moving.
Mhm.
Because he was one of the unlucky ones, but turned out to be lucky enough to be able to be the sort of person who could pull himself out, and it wasn't easy. And I sure 99% of the time would feel pretty damn proud of myself if I had been born without the privileges I was born with and still managed to like make something like, yeah. Um, for him, this was not how dare you, you're going to hell. This was just personally very painful. I define myself as I had polio and leg braces, and look at me now. And that hurt like hell to have to get to that point. How dare you? So those are the ones that really stopped me in my tracks.
I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope that other people find this topic, and especially how Professor Sapolsky argues for it and talks about it, as compelling as I do. Thank you very much, Robert and Lonnie, for inviting us to do this. I'll and everyone who's watching, listening, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you.
Well,
Oliver,
thanks to both of you, and thank you, Fan. You guys are the coolest, and I am very grateful. Uh, you asked me.
I'm glad I have that on a recording. Good. We're the coolest. I'm going to put it in quotes. Oliver, thank you for a very well-prepared, thoughtful, excellent interview with Robert. I'm sure he's grateful as well. I'm sure he's had all kinds of interviews, and they probably run a spectrum if I had to guess. Robert, thank you so much for your time. We very much appreciate, we love exercising our brains here in Fanland, and I know that those folks watching are really enjoying this conversation. I want to remind people that both Robert and Oliver will be joining After Hours today, where it's going to be starting. We're going to give them a 5-minute break in between these two Zooms. So After Hours will be starting at 1:05 p.m. Central. So make a note of that. How do you get to come to After Hours and ask your own questions and continue this discussion? Buy a copy. We prefer paperback copy because we're trying to support the paperback tour right now. Buy a paperback copy of Robert's book from our partner bookseller, The Bookstall. We've been putting the links in chat this whole time. In your receipt from the bookstall will be the link to register for After Hours. So come hang out with us. There's a lot of several great questions came in both ahead of time and during the event. I hope those folks who have posted those questions will join us. I'm sure they will. And then Oliver, I know you had at least one more question that you didn't get to, maybe 3, maybe 8 more. So we'll probably let you launch. We'll let you lead off After Hours with a question
Sure.
that you definitely want to ask. But Oliver's there as a guest, so he's there to opine as well. So we're at 1 o'clock. Someone just texted me. They don't see, look in chat. I think the text is there. Somebody just texted me. They don't see the link to the bookstall. I'm looking at it. I'm seeing it. So I'm not quite sure why others are not seeing it. Oh, you know what, Emery? I think you're, yeah, thank you. Emery, I think you posted the link to just the hosts and panelists. So if you could just do it one more time before I turn us off, post it to everyone, not just, there we go. So I'll leave it up there for another 30 seconds so folks can grab it. Sorry, that was just a quick error. She's in Costa Rica. She's already got the Band de Soleil on, so she's not paying attention anymore. All right, so thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see hopefully many of you in about 5 minutes. Thank you very much.